Absolute Darkseid just infiltrated the main DC universe, and the new form that he's taken is the most powerful form that the heroes have ever seen of him.
Peak fiction incoming.
Now, I know Absolute Darkseid is just Darkseid from the main universe, but I'm still gonna call him Absolute Darkseid because 1, it sounds cool, and technically he is the first Absolute character ever, since he's literally the embodiment of the universe. And you guys know what they say, Darkseid is Absolute. He is the end-all be-all. But today we're gonna be covering DC's brand new series, DCKO, which is basically a giant Dragon Ball-like tournament between all of the DC superheroes where they're basically fighting against each other to collect Omega energy, so one of them can become as powerful as Absolute Darkseid in hopes of saving their universe. And initially we pick up outside of an arena with Superman preparing for an upcoming battle by stretching out his body before literally wrapping both of his fists with knuckles containing miniature suns inside and then making his way through some nearby doors because it was time to enter the arena. But immediately upon stepping inside, he was overcome by fear and caught by surprise, but unfortunately we don't get an explanation as to why until later in the issue. Our story then goes a few days back into the past with Bruce, Clark, and Diana exchanging some friendly banter while playing a superhero-themed board game. And even though Clark wasn't having the best time because he only liked games where everybody could win, they couldn't deny that they were enjoying each other's company because outside of saving the world, they never really got to spend that much time with each other. Nevertheless, upon another hour passing by, all 3 members of the Trinity were a few spaces away from reaching the finish line and winning the game. But right before Diana could throw the dice on the table and possibly make the game-winning move, she was interrupted by Lois, asking them why it got so bright outside all of a sudden because the light definitely wasn't coming from the sun. And upon further inspection, they realized that they were dealing with one of the most powerful threats in the entire universe because none other than Absolute Darkseid, who was literally taller than every skyscraper in Metropolis, was in the midst of using his Omega beams to wreak havoc on the entire city. But he wasn't just wreaking havoc by simply destroying things because, as stated by the narrator, every little atom that Darkseid and his Omega beams came in contact with were actually becoming a part of him and making him even stronger. And as the Trinity began closing in on his location, they couldn't help but feel like this version of Darkseid was different from any version they had ever faced in the past, and unfortunately they couldn't have been more correct because somehow, some way, he was everywhere at once, terrorizing the Bat family in Gotham City, terrorizing the Amazons in Themyscira, and also terrorizing other heroes all across the planet at the exact same time. And soon enough, what seemed like a nightmare that couldn't get any worse quickly turned into one of the most horrifying moments that Superman ever experienced, because immediately upon Batman getting close enough to start firing shots at Darkseid effortlessly stopped him in his tracks by annihilating the Batwing with one of his Omega beams, which ended up killing him instantaneously. And if that wasn't bad enough, moments later Darkseid continued the rampage by dealing Wonder Woman the exact same fate. So with his blood pumping with rage, Clark began accelerating in Darkseid's direction, determined to avenge his fallen friends, but Darkseid's Omega beams were so incredibly intense that he ended up dying as well. And while you would assume that what we just witnessed was nothing more than a nightmare sequence or a scary vision, upon being brought over to the Justice League Watchtower, we realized that all of that actually happened because when Clark asked the Quantum Quorum when this event was gonna happen, the Time Trapper indicated that it already did happen, but by combining their chronal powers together and rewinding time by 7 days, the Quantum Quorum was able to give them one last opportunity to stop this event from taking place. And if you're wondering who the heck the Quantum Quorum is, it's basically a team consisting of the Time Trapper, Gorilla Grodd, Booster Gold, and the World Forger. And after Clark asked them what they were gonna do to prevent Darkseid from imposing his will, the Time Trapper indicated that there wasn't any hope, stating that the Quorum had explored every possible future outcome, but no matter what they tried, Darkseid always emerged victorious. Also, if you guys want to be super chill again and drop another like and comment, that would be sick. Anyways, so despite none of their heroes being in favor of this option, their only option, according to Time Trapper once again, was giving up and starting over with an entirely new universe like they did with the New 52, but unfortunately they'd lose all of their memories in the process of doing so. Nevertheless, eventually Batman wanted to know how Darkseid even became so powerful in the first place. So the World Forger used his powers to project an image while the Time Trapper explained things in greater detail, stating that Darkseid was chosen by a machine/heart inhabiting the core of Apocalypse that ran on Omega energy. And ever since then, he's been trying to turn Prime Earth into a new Apocalypse. So when he created the Absolute Universe, he placed one of these Apocalypse hearts right into the center of Earth's core, funneling all the Omega energy directly into his own being and making him the King Omega, a walking personification of all the Omega energy within the Absolute universe, which is why they needed to act as quickly as possible, because now their Earth was growing a Heart of Apocalypse as well as Darkseid continued getting closer. But refusing to believe that their universe was a lost cause, Batman thought of something that nobody on the Quantum Quorum considered, questioning if it would be possible for them to use their Earth's new Apocalypse Heart to transform one of them into a King Omega like Darkseid. According to Time Trapper though, it wasn't likely because the heart was cosmically connected to Darkseid and only served him, and in order to change that, they'd have to restart the heart entirely by blasting it with Omega energy that they didn't have. However, Batman begged to differ because after being trapped with Darkseid for years, the amount of Omega energy Booster Gold inhabited was off the charts. But Booster Gold didn't think that this was a good idea at first, expressing that they weren't comprehending what they'd be unleashing, and the World Forger was in total agreement with him, further emphasizing that the Heart of Apocalypse was a living thing, and upon being unleashed it would immediately seek somebody that was fueled by conquest. And because the heroes were too pure and too generous, the heart wouldn't even let them come close to it. In fact, as stated by Time Trapper, it was so advanced that it would probably use its fourth dimensional capabilities to defend itself by shifting into some sort of tournament to see if there was anyone worthy of its darkness. And as indicated by Gorilla Grodd, that meant that they'd be fighting against and trying to conquer one another until only one person was left, who would then be chosen as the Heart's champion and possibly be powerful enough to take down Darkseid. But knowing that this tournament would be fueled by violence, Batman then expressed that he was concerned about casualties, asking the Quantum Quorum that if the champion was able to defeat Darkseid, would they be able to bring back everything and everyone that they lost? And Booster Gold was pretty confident that whoever won should be powerful enough to reshape the universe however they wanted, but the Time Trapper still wasn't convinced that the heroes would actually be brutal enough to exterminate their fellow heroes, implying that the Apocalypse Heart would only respond to Omega energy, which was the energy of conquest. So the heroes couldn't exhibit a single ounce of mercy or compassion towards each other and needed to try winning their showdowns without holding back. However, because Superman didn't have a merciless bone in his body, it wasn't long before he was storming out of the room while stressing that they weren't going through with this. So eventually Bruce and Diana figured that they needed to talk to Clark by themselves, and in the middle of doing so, Clark expressed that if they actually tried doing this, then their greatest villains were probably gonna try following them down there, and if one of them wound up winning the tournament, then they'd be unimaginably powerful. However, Diana and Bruce didn't really think they'd have to worry about them though, expressing that keeping them away should be pretty easy because all they had to do was lock them inside the Phantom Zone. On top of being concerned with the villains though, Clark was also concerned about other things, questioning who was gonna protect the Earth while they were participating in the competition. So Diana told him that the League was already in the middle of discussing a game plan before Batman implied that he really believed that this tournament could work, so Clark needed to be more open-minded. And that's when Wonder Woman suggested that instead of thinking it as a game they were playing against each other, he needed to keep in mind that they were actually competing against Darkseid. Nevertheless, knowing that they only had 7 days until his arrival, the heroes began implementing their protocols as soon as possible. And on the first day of preparation, Mr. Terrific began dispersing modified T-Spears all across the globe in order to secure villains that the Justice League deemed most dangerous, like the Joker, Lex Luthor, Black Manta, and a bunch of other supervillains. On the second day, however, the heroes met with all the world leaders, successfully agreeing on what path they needed to take in order to advance forward. When the third day came around, it was time for Clark to address the entire world, assuring everybody that he wouldn't let their planet be destroyed like how his planet was, before guaranteeing that they'd be emerging from this battle victorious, because the world's most powerful companies like LexCorp, Wayne Enterprises, and Queen Industries had joined forces to create these things called Mega Arcs, which are basically these giant facilities built to preserve everyone just in case things went haywire, and some of the heroes like Mr. Terrific and the Titans would be staying behind to protect them. Now the fourth day on the other hand was a little more personal than the days prior, because it was a day solely dedicated to the heroes spending time with their families. We see the Bat family taking a little stroll together through Pennyworth Manor, Wonder Woman hanging out with her sisters in the Mascara, and a bunch of other heroes spending time with their family members in one way or another. But as Clark strolled through the park with Lois, Joan, and Kara, he wasn't really able to have a good time because he couldn't help but notice how the heartbeats of practically every citizen around him was beating out of fear. Nevertheless, the fifth day of preparation consisted of the heroes preparing for the tournament itself by going into their bunkers and sacred vaults, because each of them were allowed to bring one item to use against the other heroes. Some of the heroes decided to go for an offensive upgrade, like when Batman chose the Justice Buster 2. Other heroes like Diana decided to go the more strategic route by settling on her God Killer armor. And then there were heroes like Cyborg who chose to go the defensive route by upgrading the father box. After that, our story goes over to the 6th and final day, just one day before the arrival of Darkseid, where it was time for them to start heading through something called the Scartaris Nexus, which is basically a passage to the center of the Earth. And immediately upon their arrival, they started blasting the Heart of Apocalypse with Booster Gold's Omega energy, which was just enough power to make the heart stop for a few short moments. But as stated by the narrator, whose identity still isn't known at this point, upon the heart reawakening, it actually greeted all of the heroes with a miraculous vision where they basically saw themselves becoming all-powerful by winning the tournament. But just as fast as the vision came, it vanished, and soon enough, every single one of them found themselves at the arena gates surrounded by darkness. Which actually brings us back to the very moment Clark stepped outside in the beginning of the issue, revealing that the reason he was so frightened and panicked was because as soon as he stepped outside, there were 3 monstrous entities demanding him to take a step back because he needed to wait for the other combatants. And that's when we see Swamp Thing, Plastic Man, Batman, and a bunch of other heroes decked out in their new gear and ready to go to war. However, as stated by one of the giant monster dudes, they wouldn't be going into battle just yet because only the first 32 heroes who made it to a portal at the end of a death trap obstacle course would qualify to move forward. As the heroes prepared to take off though, waiting for one of the monsters to drop their mace, which was basically their signal to start running, instead of paying attention to the obstacles ahead, Billy Batson was focused on Superman, implying that this tournament would finally allow them to see which one of them was stronger, only to be absolutely annihilated by the monster's mace just moments later, resulting in the first disqualification. However, despite the fact that it was time to start running, Superman's blood was already boiling after seeing Shazam get squashed like a bug, so he blasted off into the air, knocking one of the monster's teeth out. But knowing that he was losing sight of their main objective, Batman would then blast him in the back with a miniature explosive, stating that he needed to keep his freaking head in the game. After that, we see all the heroes running and flying as fast as they possibly could, but it wasn't long before heroes like Damage and Adam Strange were absolutely incinerated after stepping on trap floor pieces. Moments later though, things got even worse because Jay Garrick ended up stepping on a trap floor piece as well, which resulted in a bunch of powerful parademons called Omega Demons being released onto the obstacle course. So obviously the heroes banded together and started eliminating them one by one, but eventually, as Clark was finishing up with an entire group of Omega Demons, heroes like Diana, Vixen, and Supergirl started qualifying after crossing into the portal. However, as the portal grew smaller and smaller, it was only becoming more and more obvious that Clark was holding back because instead of going into the portal himself, he was clearing the way for his friends by choosing to fight more groups of Omega Demons. So Batman decided that it was time he confronted him about it in hopes of helping him focus, but in the midst of doing so, a massive spear went flying through the air before piercing him right through the chest. A spear that was shot by none other than the Joker himself, because a huge portion of the villains that they were keeping in the Phantom Zone somehow managed to escape, and as soon as they made their arrival, they began crossing into the portal after laughing in Superman's face. And that's when Superman grew so angry that his eyes began glowing red while thinking of Bruce's last words, before finally deciding that he was done playing nice and done holding back as he blasted into the portal himself as the last person to qualify. After that, we get a nice splash page revealing every single character that ended up qualifying, with the narrator questioning which of these champions would be crowned the King Omega. However, on the next page, we find out that the Heart of Apocalypse itself has been narrating this entire time, stating that it actually already knew who the champion was gonna be, and it also knew about all the twists and surprises that the heroes would soon encounter. And one of those surprises was Darkseid's 3 horsemen, who are actually none other than Absolute Batman, Absolute Wonder Woman, and Absolute Superman. But the real surprise was that according to the Heart of Apocalypse, none of the heroes were gonna win the competition, because what not a single one of them knew was that there was one last competitor among them who was none other than Darkseid himself. So the game wasn't just beginning, the game was already over. But sadly, that's when this issue comes to an end. But if you guys want to see what happens with DCKO next, let me know in the comments down below.